Okay, so welcome everybody to this session, The Left, the Right and the Culture Wars. We're going to be hearing from two speakers, Kevin Ovenden, who's a long-standing socialist member of Counterfire, and Mike Wayne. Both Kevin and Mike contribute regularly to the website and have written lots of relevant and interesting articles that you can find on the website and hopefully you should be able to find in the chat. We're going to get straight to it before going into questions and answers. So over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Alia, and thanks to Counterfire for inviting me to speak on this. So I think, to understand the culture wars, you have to understand the political cultures that are producing them. Now, the dominant political cultures of our time are conservatism and liberalism. It's important to understand their dynamics. They're both partners and competitors in the running of neoliberal capitalism. They're partners because they both agree that there's no turning back to social democracy. For them, liberal capitalism is the future. Therefore, in the mainstream, there is this prevailing consensus on political economy, despite all the insecurity and instability and inequality that it generates. But they are competitors too in terms of the leadership of neoliberal capitalism. And they do have different political and cultural values. Now, for quite a long time, those differences were embedded with an overarching consensus. But interacting with the economic crisis of 2007 to 2008, these differences have germinated and fertilized, and they've eventually produced a very significant internal disagreement, particularly around the most important one, particularly around interstate relationships. How states relate to each other with an international capitalist context. So that's what Brexit was all about. So we have, on the one hand, this consensus on political economy, but on the other hand, we have an increasingly deep and divisive contestation around cultural politics. So now, if we think of conservatism and liberalism as a spectrum, in the middle of the spectrum, there remains a lot of overlap and consensus and shared values. Hence, a good chunk of the Parliamentary Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats, and the sort of quote unquote sensible moderate conservatives were joined around, in trying to sort of defeat Brexit. But both conservatism and liberalism also have these radicalized wings. And these radicalized wings are the ones that are making the running in the culture war. And of course, it's the radical wing of conservatism that has basically, won the leadership of the Conservative Party. So let's just have a little look at what the key ingredients of these political cultures are. So with conservatism, it is the dominant political culture of the nation state. It has a strong sort of investment in the law and order state, so it can quell internal discontents to its free market commitments. It has a history as an imperial state as it hoovers up resources around the world. And obviously that means repressing external resistance to that. Connected to that has been the development of an exclusivist white ethnocentric orientation around national belonging and identity. That has in recent years been nuanced and modified to some extent, but it's still very present and there. There's also a long-standing kind of cherished myths of freedoms, supposedly stretching back to Magna Carta, and connected to that sort of reactionary romanticism invested in institutions like Parliament and the monarchy. And above all, those interstate relations, conservatism is now really committed to bilateralism in interstate relations. It doesn't like multilateralism, feels that's constrained by multilateral commitments, and feels that it's a big enough state on on the world stage to kind of get its own way in bilateral relations. And now we can see the cultural politics that flow from this sort of cluster all around us. We see the crime bill going through that's going to effectively criminalize protest. Conservatism's interpretation and leadership of the vote to leave the EU, which it defined as Brexit. Even the sort of forthcoming Freedom Day, the elimination of safety measures in the middle of a pandemic, taps into conservatism's very peculiar sense of liberty, and I'm sure the virus is going to appreciate that. Now, liberalism, which dominates the parliamentary Labour Party, almost said Conservative Party, Freudian slip, dominates the PLP ever since the 90s. They've eliminated social democracy as a real alternative. They've relegated Labourism to the margins, and it's characterised really by 4 M's. First of all, multilateralism. They've got a big investment in supranational governance institutions, which they see as somehow more rational than nation state rivalries and the kind of wars that has often led to. So they see it as a more rational form of organizing capitalism. Secondly, multiculturalism, which is part of their idea of kind of liberalism's idea of harmonizing cross-border flows of capital and labor. And it's important, I think, to know that this really is an appropriation of the left's earlier defense of immigrant communities against institutional racism and even sort of popular, well, not popular, but grassroots fascism. And it's what they've done, sort of this multiculturalism. It severs the integral connection between racism and elite class projects. So just think about how a quite muted response really to the scandal of Windrush within political and media circles compared to the manufactured outrage around anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. The Labour Party was, branded institutionally anti-Semitic. Compare that with the quite muted response to Windrush. This really was, state racism writ large in the Home Office, in the legislature, in the Tory Party. But I don't remember people routinely calling Theresa May a racist in the way that they were smearing Jeremy Corbyn. And I think that actually links to one of the features of culture wars is a tendency towards a kind of opportunistic and cynical appropriation of what are real social grievances. The third M is meritocracy. Liberalism is absolutely invested in individual social mobility, and education is a key policy plank for that. And finally, modernization. Liberalism equates change, especially technological change, with progress. Now, if you think about liberal organs like The Guardian, they think that it's only conservatism that plays the game of culture wars. But actually, liberalism plays that game very adeptly as well. And what both of them do is they use culture wars to divide where they should unite, and unite where, well, we would want to divide, where there are real irreconcilable material differences. So think about how conservatism has united a section of the small c conservative working class in the north outside the big urban centres. It's managed to, at an electoral level, which is not inconsequential as we're now finding out, bonded to the big C of the Conservative Party, exactly where we would want there to be a fundamental division. And they've split this demographic, as it were, off from a broader conception of the working class, which would include multicultural urban working class. Liberalism does the exact reverse. It's bonded a multicultural working class and middle class to capitalism, where we would want to see a division. And they send very clear signals that the small c working class demographics who, for example, voted to leave the EU are not part of their block of alliances. And the reverse is true. Conservatism, part of the culture wars, you send signals to the other social groups are not part of your moral political bloc. So the recent report into racism that the Conservatives published, which found that there's no such thing as institutional racism, for example, and basically saying to people, to black people, that just shut up and be quiet because you're here on sufferance, as it were. So again, what they do is they create a unity where there should be a division. The liberals do this, and a division where there should be a unity. So culture wars are very significantly a product of TINA, there is no alternative, because, you know, what else do you do with your political energies and your hopes and your conversations if you cannot address the real source and substance of your concerns, i.e., you know, the political economy of neoliberal capitalism? However, I don't think it's entirely about that. I think also, you know, the culture that we live in has changed quite considerably in the last half century. I think contestation is kind of baked into it, and in a positive way. You know, we live in a very much more pluralized culture. Lots of, you know, factors driving that. Cross-border flows of people and culture is one driver. Capitalism's sensitivity to new trends and developments in civil society, and then the ability to turn those into markets, which then kind of institutionalize, if you like, those differences, is another. So in many ways, this is all positive. All these different value systems bumping up against one another can promote healthy dialogue and encourage each of us to exercise our critical judgments, you know, where the latest trends and developments and issues touch on matters of consequence. Think about, for example, you know, what we eat and how that has become politicized in recent years. There was no politics of food, 50 years ago. So, but however, because we're also trapped inside capitalism, this diversity always has the possibility of becoming something more negative and divisive. And I think the very term culture wars gives us a clue as to what's going on here. I think it's a mistake to see culture through the lens of war. I mean, you know, in a war, armed combatants are seeking to physically liquidate opponents. That's not really, generally speaking, what culture is about. It's, you know, it's a relatively speaking, a free form of living, expressive living. It's, you know, values, habits, conversations, dialogue, debate. It is struggle, of course, but it's, you know, generally speaking, it's fairly low risk struggle. It's not about physically eliminating people. So, but if you apply that mindset to culture, I think it's not a surprise to find that you get a very vitriolic and almost hysterical kind of situation. So that, you know, the conservatives denounce every liberal gesture as cultural Marxism, such as taking the knee, and conversely, you know, liberal positions, when they're questioned, they're denounced, you know, as, you know, as fascists. Just think about the vocabulary that liberalism has developed, for example, around culture. Hate speech, that's a very interesting word. Feeling unsafe, as if you're kind of a guerrilla army that could be sort of mowed down at any moment. Words like triggering, that's a very interesting word, isn't it? It sort of evokes munitions. Again, this is a sort of atmosphere of war. I think that's one reason why liberal cultural politics is becoming very authoritarian. It's as if they are faced with the criticism of weapons and not the weapon of criticism, you know, to use Marx's distinction. The other thing about culture wars, I think, is that they're very moralizing. And that is to be expected, because what I'm saying is that culture wars, as they've sort of developed, are really about culture uncoupling itself from being able to tackle the political economy of capitalism. And that's the same with moralizing as well. It's not, moralizing is moral talk that is really uncoupled from how people actually live their lives, you know, what the conditions are in which people live their lives. In both cases, the solution for the left is not to stop talking about morals, it's to ground morals. Same with culture, it's not to stop talking about culture, but it's to ground culture. I think the culture wars are, you know, they're very intense, and you know, the left is in danger of being dragged in their wake. And I think what we have to do instead is assert our independence from conservatism and liberalism. You know, culture wars need to be fought with class analysis. They need to be fought with materialism from both the physical sciences. For example, you know, biology does matter. And they have to be fought with historical materialism. And a unity has to be forged by reconstructing the political economy of capitalism. That's really the only basis for a flourishing of cultures.
Thank you. Excellent timekeeping there, Mike, and really good points made as well. Kevin, over to you, please.
Thanks very much. Thank you particularly to Mike for giving us a great introduction, which I'm going to move from the broad analysis that Mike's given us, to look a little bit more specifically at the way that the Tories are doing a culture war in Britain. And it's a strange kind of culture war, because according to them, it's the other people who are doing the culture war. All that's happening is that they're responding. And there is a new right-wing grouping of the Tory MPs called the Common Sense Group. And there's an excellent article, I really recommend it to people, by John Westmoreland on the Counterfire website about this. I think it's a couple of days old. People should have a look. Hopefully not now, I mean a little bit after the meeting, or maybe you can multitask and do both at the same time. But this is a grouping of people. I'm going to summarize it because John has gone through in detail what they stand for and the arguments against it. But essentially they say that Britain is dominated culturally by a left liberal dictatorship, and that we need to undo all of this. We need to break this liberal left hold upon the institutions of British society. Now, there is an affinity here with the hard right, who are actually in government of their own accord or under their own steam in Hungary and in Poland, where we've seen that kind of culture war. They talk of a language of a culture war, a war against modernization, a war against progress. They've used that to come to power and to hold power very, very strongly, particularly in the case of Hungary. And this is definitely what this part of the Tory right, you could almost say far right, although it is still within the Tory party, is about. Now, it's a ridiculous notion that Britain institutionally, at its elite level, in terms of all the levers of power, is dominated by the liberal left. Look at the BBC. Go back years ago, go back to one of the bombing campaigns against Gaza. The BBC was the institution which refused to allow an advert for the Gaza appeal, which was run by people like Oxfam, Save the Children, perfectly respectable people. This is in no way a left-dominated society, and even when the left, in its broadest sense, Labour has been in, we've seen extremely conservative positions adopted around asylum seekers, and of course, ultimately, around the question of war. What is more illiberal than going to war against another country and then justifying it on the basis that the culture of 1.8 billion people, Muslims around the world, is somehow inferior? So that's not true, that Britain is dominated by the liberal left. What is a partial truth is that the public opinion, social attitudes in Britain have never been more liberal. Now that might seem a shock, and I certainly, in saying that, and I'm saying it in a shocking way, I don't want to imply at all that there is no problem with racism, no problem with sexism, just increasing sexualized objectification of women, all sorts of reactionary ideas. There are a lot of reactionary ideas, and there are a minority of people who hold extremely reactionary ideas. But if you look at it over, Mike mentioned 50 years, there's never been a time when on virtually every social indicator, not just the economic ones, but ones to do with what you might call progressive and liberal rights, there's never been a time when the balance of opinion has been at an average level better than it is now. And I want to start with that in a way, because this ought to give us confidence in resisting all of the flag waving, all of the attempts, as Mike put it, to form a unity between a part of the working class and the bosses through the conservative route, and to divide the working class. This should give us confidence that it's possible to resist this. It's not true that everybody agrees with us. Possibly only a minority agree with what most of what we say, but it's also not true that a majority of people strongly agree with what they're doing, and therefore they have to fight very hard. And not only do they have to fight very hard, they have to be a bit more subtle than just the knuckle draggers of the backbench Tory right. And we see this. I want to give an example. The tearing down of the Colston statue, the slaver in Bristol last year. There were couple of opinion polls. The exact details don't matter. The gist of it is this, that about 2/3 of them, 60%, 2/3 of people were against the Colston statute. This is across Britain. Only 1/3 were in favour or weren't sure. But amongst those who were against it, about half were for tearing it down. The other half who were against it thought it should have been done through more legal channels. So you have essentially 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, going from radical through to a degree of conservative thought. And the Tories, to some extent, understood this. Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, she knew she couldn't just run with the line that actually the British Empire is wonderful, there's no problem with slavery, because people have a lot of contradictory, at least, thoughts about that. So they honed in on the question of tearing down the statue, which had provoked the national conversation in the first place. And what they wanted to do, and what is the underlying strategy of the government, as well as the more right-wing elements increasing and trying to rehabilitate outright, thoroughly reactionary ideas, their strategy is to try to make the left, the socialist left, appear the minority and to choose issues where we are pushed into just fighting for a minority position and end up feeling besieged rather than feeling that we can win a wider ground. And you saw that over the report that Mike mentioned, the discredited CRED report on racial and ethnic disparities in Britain. There was a hardline attack, which was essentially, there's no such thing as institutionalized racism. And it was kind of relying upon the fact that quite a lot of people might not know what something called institutionalized racism is, but when it's explained, people are a little bit more receptive to it. So it's relying on a degree of ignorance, but they also did something more, a little more subtle. Kemi Badok, who is of Nigerian descent, and not posh school descent, minister for the Tory party, quite cleverly in the House of Commons tried to say, look, the problem is that the left is going on about symbols, statues. We're giving you a 10-year fine, by the way, 10-year prison sentence if you take down statues. But the left is interested in statues, in language, in the symbolism. We conservatives, and I'm talking to you as a Black Nigerian conservative, are dealing with the real issues, the real problems, material problems facing Black and white people. We're talking about the levelling up and so on. Now, it's complete hogwash, but it can have a certain purchase. It can have a purchase by playing upon the weaknesses of the left, of much of the left. I'm going to say something about that now, but in doing so, I want to say, to emphasize this point, they play on the weaknesses of the left and some of our political and theoretical mistakes across the left as a whole. It is not the left that's responsible for the attack. The attack would come anyway. We have to deal with this question by how we deal with the right, how we fight the right, and we deal with the weaknesses on the left on the basis of whether left politics, what kind of left politics can confront the right. The first weakness is this, and I'll just say Keir Starmer sums it up. And I'm talking about the left most broadly, the Labour movement, the Labour Party, including its leadership, because it still is part of the Labour movement. And that is complete capitulation whenever these kind of issues are raised. I mean, there's been several references to it, but the shocking support for maintaining the north of Ireland inside the United Kingdom, as opposed to even having a neutral position by Keir Starmer, sums it up this weekend. I'd say even worse has been the way in which the Labour Party's tried to account for losing, going from 30,000 votes in the Batley and Spen election in 2017 to about 13,000 votes now, and explaining that by heaping abuse and racist stereotypes upon Muslims. Incredibly dangerous. You think you're going to lose the election and you say it's because they're anti-Semitic. You win the election and you say you lost votes because they're homophobic and misogynistic. And that percolates through the society. And if you like, the first problem we have is that at an official national level, you have no real opposition to what the Tories are doing, that they get to set the terms. Boris Johnson puts up a flag, so does Keir Starmer. Boris Johnson puts up 2 flags, and there is this drift to the right, and it's underlying it is an analysis at the heart of the Labour Party, and shared not just in the Labour Party but more widely, that there is a block of reactionary opinion, sometimes called the white working class or traditional working class, but there's this block of opinion, and that the only thing which is reactionary on all sorts of social issues, social and conservative, and that the only thing you can do is accommodate for that. And unfortunately, this does not just come from the right of the Labour Party. When Jeremy Corbyn was elected in 2015, there were erstwhile advisors saying that you need to accommodate over things like nationalism, over NATO, over family values, because these are popular and what have you. Now, funnily enough, that same idea, that same fixed idea of the mass of working class people underpins another problem, which I want to move on to now. Seemingly, it's the opposite problem. It's from people who very much want to promote progressive ideas, anti-racist, anti-sexist ideas, challenge the idea that we have to accommodate to those in order to make advance in our campaigns and in our movements. But they share the idea that there are lots of people who are fixed in this category, the socially conservative. And you get it less now, but I don't know about anybody else. For 2-3 years, all this talk of gammons and boomers, an entire layer of working class people written off by people who are actually quite radical, wanted radical change, but had come to the conclusion that there was the progressive people, and then there were the reactionary people. And what's missing out in all of this is the idea that there are very few people who are at those kind of polls, occupy those kind of polls. There's a lot of contradictory, mixed thinking, and the thing is unstable and shifts according to all sorts of circumstances. Crucially, the struggles people are involved in, but also the arguments and the activity of the radical left. And that's so. For example, the Battery and Spen by-election, all these allegedly reactionary Muslims somehow delivered 30,000 votes, along with white people, mainly working class people, in 2017. But then under Corbyn, but then their reactionary values prevented them from voting Labour this time. It doesn't really fit, and I don't think it fits in any of our experiences. I want to talk about the very final points about why this is important for us to understand, and it's not writing off of people if we're to respond to the Tory offensive. Because I think that we have on the left, on the one hand, quite a lot of people who've become radicalized, have moved to the left. We also have, I would say, quite a lot of demoralization. The impact of the defeat of Corbynism, and then associated with that, the rise of Keir Starmer, some hopes from many friends of mine that it wouldn't be as bad as that, now are feeling more demoralized. And that can often lead to looking inwards. And one feature of looking inwards is to find what's sometimes today called a purity spiral, looking for more and more the differences on the left, and more who has a more pure understanding of particularly issues of oppression, rather than how we look outwards and start off with the practical unity in the struggles, not with the particular ideologies that we hold, the particular ideas. And it's in that way, the first way, that we're able to draw on, I started off with common sense, a phrase from the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci is good sense, not just the common national sense, but the good sense of working class and oppressed people, which doesn't mean it's perfectly formed. Over the question of racism or immigration, it can involve contradictory ideas that we don't need more immigration, we need to stop more immigration, at the same time as I'm against the deportation of the people who live next door. We have to draw on one side against the other. The very final thing is, I think this also means a turning out of the culture of the radical, of the anti-capitalist left. What I mean by that is this was put very well by the black radical, black revolutionary, Ambalada Sivanandan, back in the 1980s. He played a word game with Marx's famous quote that philosophers have only interpreted the world, the point is to change it. He said that in a period of defeat, if you feel that you can't change the world, then the point is to change the interpretation of the world. So he's making a joke. And I think you have quite a lot of that as a product of demoralization. We can't really change things. We can't move the mass of people. So therefore we have more and more splintering arguments. And I think we need to move against that. So I think I'll leave it there, but I think that we're in a good position to be able to do that, or at least not a bad position to be able to do that, because the real things that are driving the lives of working class people are throwing people into some form of opposition to the system, often confused. No one comes to socialism with perfect ideas, but that's where we need to be as a radical left, I think.